Okay, welcome back. Let's get started with the quadruped legs. We're gonna divide this lecture into. I'm gonna divide this lecture into a part two series because there's. We want to go from like basic stuff to a little bit more advanced stuff. It'll still be pretty light, so everybody can follow along even with no experience. So, let's see here. We're gonna talk about quickly choosing our pivot points for the character, either by looking at some reference or at least talk about like how the animal anatomy works for a quadruped leg. We're going to talk a little bit about Maya's different solvers and so on. So once we've chosen our pivot points, we're going to add the solvers and add some mechanisms to the leg so it can move around. And we're going to do the basics first because we always start basic and then we build on top of that. There's no need for us to start super advanced and then suddenly get lost in the whole thing and not be able to deliver anything to our animators. We want to be able to give something to them so they have something to work with so they can move on with the pipeline while we're developing the advanced topics. So we start out very basic and then once the basic pivot points and the basic mechanics have been added, we're just going to quickly add some foot rolls, just the basic rolls, so our animators can get started doing their cycles and testing the rig. And that's basically it for the part 1 series. We're going to cover all the basics. In the part 2 of this series, we're going to talk about some automated mechanics, such as we want to be able to make the ball roll of our quadruped leg. We want to make that mechanical and automated, so when you're blocking it, when your animators are blocking in their shot, the leg will automatically be bending. And we're gonna make a switch so we can like blend between automated and not automated. And all of that will be covered in part 2. And then we're gonna talk a little bit about front leg versus hind leg. I'll have a separate lecture about how to attach the front leg since we want to do some specific stuff with the clavicles. How we can make that rotate around our rib cage instead of just having it as a floating point. And then at the end, we're going to clean up our module and make sure that everything is nice and tidy, so nothing is confusing in case that another rigger would have to open up our character. But that's basically going to be it for the quadruped legs. So let's get to it. Okay, so here we are in Maya, and now we're going to start out by just doing the hind legs for this character. Let's start out by going into the side view here, and I'm just gonna go into. I'm gonna hold down space and go into skeleton. I'm assuming that you kind of know where the joints are. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start out by placing my joints, and I like to have my hind joint for the femur a little bit high here. I've made sure that my feet are straight along the axis as much as we can without changing the model too much. So let's just place that here and hit this one here so we can see our buttons or our joints through the model, so we're x-raying our joints. So I'm just going to place my first joint here and I'm roughly just going to go around. You might notice that I'm not placing them completely where you would have the actual bone, but we need to compensate for the thickness of the model as well. Where it's actually nice for us to bend around in order to get the best deformation. So I'm just gonna do something like this to start with. I can always change this stuff because what you do in rigging is that you will later on learn how to script this stuff up. So I'm just showing you how to do the basics. But normally you would have even dailies with your team around where you put your pivot points so everybody can sort of like give feedback. No one can do like a perfect rig alone. You always need a team. So in this case, I'm just gonna sit here and like move these things around a little bit. If I hold down D, I get a free pivot point, and then because I'm in the side view, I can only move that in the side view. So I think I kind of want to do something like here maybe, which is probably roughly about where the same is. So I'm not really worried about like how my joints are rotating right now because I'm gonna be orienting them in a second. I think I just want to keep this in the middle. Let's think about like when this thing is bending. I'll probably want this to stay a little bit stiffer. Let's think so that it's a funny heel here. So yeah, I think I'm just gonna keep that here, roughly about here, and then when he bends up, this will probably stay stiff. Yeah, I think we could do something like this. So let's see here. So let's just quickly name these. So let's call that, this is left hind. Let's call it leg hind. And I'll talk about like naming convention in the scripting class, but so far just bear with me. We're gonna call it leg hind, AJA, JNT. And the reason why we call it AJA is because if I had two hind legs that was on the left side, like sometimes you will have a character that has two arms on one side. Let's say it's a creature. You can call that AJA, or you can call it BJA, or CJA. So if you have 9 tails, you would call them A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and so on. And it's the cleanest way of like naming stuff. So let's just use that, and then B, so C, D. So normally I would definitely use a script for doing this sort of stuff, but because we're doing like everything without any scripts now, and I'm just going to do everything manually so everybody is at the same page. And I'm going to go into my perspective view. So the way I'm just quickly doing that is that I'm holding down space and clicking in the middle here, middle mouse clicking in the middle, and then just dragging upwards to the perspective view, so you can see like how I can quickly switch in and out of my views. Oh, sorry. Top view, side view. And you can see like if your views look like this, where my top view is completely black, it's probably because I'm inside my creature. And if I go in here and if I hit this one while I'm inside the top view, so you can see I'm in the top view here and it's black, so I hit this one here, which means that it's selecting my top view camera. Go into perspective view. Oh, okay, my camera is actually placed inside of my character, so I drag that out here. I can quickly unhide that so you can see the camera is here. And now if I go into my top view, okay, now I can see that my character is actually here. So don't worry if it's dark. You can just move that camera out of your creature. So you can see like I placed my joint in the side view, which means that it's actually just placed it in the complete middle. And I'm just gonna move that out here so it starts fitting into my character's leg. And I really wanna, for simplicity, in a proper pipeline we could have probably made a script that could just work like this, because we would use some vector math to place our pivot points. But for simplicity, and for this beginner tutorial, we're going to keep our legs as straight as possible. I would normally do this for a lot of cartoony stuff, but maybe in realistic stuff it's worth, it would be worth maybe to have your actual anatomy placed a little bit more correctly than just keeping straight lines. But in this case I think we should just keep the straight lines, because we're trying to make something where everybody has a chance to follow along. I'm quickly noticing that I think that my femur might be a little bit high here, so I'm just going to take that down and tap else. Our rotation pivot, we can imagine that we probably rotate around something like this. So I feel this is quite good. We could probably have it a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but we can fix that in scanning. Let's try and just go from here. So the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into, if I hold down W, every time I'm creating something like a cube, you can see like I'm getting a pivot. My pivot point is showing here. If I hold down W, which is the way you go into your move tool, if you hold that and left mouse click, or hold down left mouse click, I get the options to choose my pivot points, and I do that instead of going into tools, going in here, choosing whatever like object direction I want. So instead I can just go here and say like, okay, I want world, no I want object, no I want world. You know, I can switch them around, symmetry. I can set them to, if I want to go like axis, I can set it to edge, and I can choose that where my next position should be. So you can see like now it's actually following that axis. So in this case, I'm just gonna go into my my joint and see where my pivot point is actually pointing, and I can see that it's actually pointing down the direction, which is great. So let's check how they're actually moving, or how they're actually oriented. So you can see here, in this case, my Y is actually pointing forward, and here it's pointing backwards. So it means that we have some problems with our orientation. And let's fix that by using the orient joint. So skeleton, orient joint. And quickly just, we want to talk about like how we orient joints. So the way you orient a joint is you go in the x-axis, which means that where it's pointing for the next joint, and that's fine. So let's just use x, which means that our rotation would also be rotating in x. That's all fine. So what does these things mean? So the secondary axis means we're gonna determine which direction the secondary axis is going. It doesn't really matter which axis you choose, if it's Y or Z, but we can definitely choose like which way we want it to go. So if you choose the secondary axis to be Z, this one, blue one, and now it's asking me like which way should Z point, and this is compared to the world rotations. So if I create like an object here, you can see like the starting point is set forward, X to the side, Y up, and that's specific for Maya. So it's asking me like which way should the set now point, and I'm saying like it should point in the X direction, but I want it to point in the minus, which is actually what it's doing right now. So let's just say that, okay, I want it to point in X, but I want it to point in X positive. And let's see if we can predict where it's going to go. So I'm predicting that the Z-axis will go this direction, the Y-axis will go this direction, because you can see like I have to rotate this 180 degrees in order to get my Z over here. So you can see like how that stays true. And let's go down here and see if we're remaining the same. And now our joints are oriented correctly. And just to, you don't usually need to orient your last joint, but if you hit orient joint to world, the world of this joint will be its parent. So if I do like that, it's going to get the same orientation as the previous joint. So now our leg is actually oriented correctly, and we're good to start making the mechanics. So now we covered like a little bit of the pivot point as we talked about in the introduction, and we're going to move on to start placing some pole vectors. So let's try and go into the IK handle tool. And to begin with, we're just going to make like a very simple rotate plane solver. And I'm going to select the first joint and the third joint. So in scripting, that would be the starts in 0, so that would be 0, 1, 2. And I'm going to call this my L leg hind IK. Great. That means that I'd always be careful about moving these things around without creating orient groups or anything to determine where they're actually placed, because if we start moving them around and we suddenly run out of undos, we can't really go back to original position. So at least not super easy. So just to keep things simple, let's just not move it around right now. So the next thing I want to do is create a controller. And the way we create a controller, so I'm just gonna go through like the basics of creating all this stuff, and then I'll later on just create like a little script that'll create these things for me. So I'm just gonna size that up a little bit, freeze it, and duplicate it. No, I'm not gonna duplicate. I'm just gonna create a group and parent that underneath that group. I'm gonna call this L leg hind control, and then let's call this one, just so we have all the naming, orient group, and we can actually duplicate that, delete this one, parent this one into the hierarchy, and then parent the controller underneath. So now I have like, it's just a basic hierarchy, right? So I have 1, 2 groups, and I'm going to call this a, instead of having an orient, I'm just going to call it a modify group. So in this case, if I wanted to add some set different keys or add some mechanics on direct connection, I would do it to the modify group, and then my orient group will be the group that's basically just going to hold the translation and rotation. You don't need that, but it's nice to have. So I'm going to place that here on my joint. So I hold down V to snap it to my joint. And I'm just going to press F8 to size that up a little bit. Okay, so the reason it's turning gray here now is because I have symmetry turned on. And you could go in down here under the controller and see where your symmetry is hit on. Let's see if we can see that somewhere. So I'm lazy, so even though we could probably find it here, where the hell is? I never use this anymore. I always use the hotkeys because this is too slow. Yeah, I don't even recall. It doesn't really matter. So I'm gonna hold down, just as I showed before, how to choose a pivot or a direction. I hold down W and left mouse click, and then I go to symmetry. Sorry, I'm so slow at like saying these things because it just comes like second nature to me now. So if I go to there, you can see like it gets out of the gray zone. I'm just gonna move that out here. Hit F8. Now we can see our controller. So just as a test now we can pair our IK handle underneath this one. No, actually, let's go back because we quickly want to create a pole vector. So the way we're gonna talk quickly about like how you would place a pole vector. So normally you could, in scripting, you would probably do like Seth Willey, or the Ryan Traubitz guys from Naughty Dog. They use vector math where they take this point, this point, this point, and then they calculate the vector from here, and they calculate the vectors of these, and then they halve that, and then they calculate the vector between these 2 points and duplicate that out so it will come in the perfect direction. We're not going to do that because I don't want to go too much into scripting, so we're just going to go the easy way, where we're going to create a CV curve tool, and I'm going to say one linear. I'm going to snap that here to these points. I'm going to go in, I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to go into object mode, and I'm going to go to axis, and I'm going to go to normals, and now you can see I can push this one out in a normal, which means that I'm in the normal direction of this plane, which means that my pole vector will not flip anything. So I'm just going to duplicate my hind leg here. I'm going to go into modify, search and replace names, and I'm going to say leg hind, replace that with leg, let's just call it leg hind pole v for pole vector. That'll be fine. And then delete that one there, because now it's not, obviously not the same name. Oh damn, now I deleted my curve. Let's just recreate that quickly. So CV, snap, snap, snap. I'm holding V as I'm snap. Go into component mode, get that thing out there. And then if I hold down, now I can see, now I won't have a pivot. And the reason why I don't have a pivot is because I'm currently in the axis of the normal, so it doesn't really show me that because I'm not in a component mode. So I'm just going to go into world. Sorry. So if I go into world, now you can see that my pivot is back here. And I hold down C. C for chill. And then I can snap that to a curve, just like if you hold down V for snapping to a point. If you hold down C, I can snap along a curve. And just drag that out until it gets stuck in the corner. So now I know that my controller is exactly in front of my leg, which means that my pole vector will not rotate. So I select my controller and I select the pole vector, and then I say constrain, and then I say pole vector constraint. So now the leg is rotating. Perfect. Second thing I'm going to do is, just for now, it's not going to be permanent, but for now I'm just going to put my IK controller underneath my foot so I can see that that's actually moving around, and bam, we have our first like little movement. So you'll see like how this stuff is floating around. That's because we don't have anything to actually control these two joints. But that's what we're gonna do next. So let's put that back. I'm just gonna press F8 here and try and rotate this. So as long as I'm only rotating the shape of this object, I can change it as much as I want, as long as I don't change the actual rotation and translation of it. It's only the shape, so everything, if I can right click on this stuff and I say show shapes, show shapes, you can see that this shape node here, and it actually, a shape node doesn't really do anything to any movement. It doesn't determine any aim for our IK handle. So let's just not show shapes here again, so it's less confusing. And there we go. Okay, so let's continue with making. So that's like actually the very basics of like creating the IK foot. So now we're gonna continue IK leg. So now we're gonna continue to making the foot. So if I say IK handle tool, and now I want to go into the toolbox and I want to change this to a single chain solver, because we're not going to create a pole vector for these. So I'm just going to create one from hind leg C to hind leg D, and one from D to the end. And I'm going to call this my L leg hind ball IK, and I'm going to call it IKS for single plane, and I'm going to call this an IKR for rotate plane. And we're going to do this for the toe. Great. So now everything is now all the IK handles are created. So if we just take these two and parent them underneath our controller as well, now you'll see like now you see that the foot is actually no longer like floating around. It's actually following. So far so good, but now we need to do some rolls. But right now I just want to save because we don't want to redo work or anything. So I'm just going to hold Control Shift S to save, and I'm just going to go in here and name give it another version. You can go with automated versioning up and all that stuff. I don't personally like that, but you can do whatever you feel like for saving. Okay, so next thing we're going to do here is that we're going to create some locators. You can use like anything you want, locators, joints, whatever, to make the foot rolls. I personally find locators fine. I like that there's a visual representation. Some people want to go with groups, but I like that there's something visual that I can see inside my viewport. So I'm just going to call this L leg. Let's call it L foot. And we want to determine that it's a hind leg, so I'm going to say L foot hind. And we're going to call that a heel roll locator. I'm going to duplicate that name. I'm going to duplicate this thing, the locator. I'm going to call this the toe roll. And I'm going to make one more. It's going to call the ball roll. And I think we're just going to stay, maybe we just want one more that's called tip rotation. Let's call it tip roll. Because what we want to do is we want to be able to rotate the foot so it goes rotating here, but only this part. And we also want to make sure that we can rotate from here so the whole leg continues forward. So now I'm just going to create like a little bit of a hierarchy here. So the heel roll comes first. So let's keep that like that. And then the toe roll comes second. So once we've been able to rotate our heel from the back, we can rotate it back and forward. We want to be able to rotate from here, so we can rotate forwards and backwards. You'll see that in a second. And then the ball roll and the tip roll, we're just going to put them here for now. Talk a little bit about those in a second. So the first thing I'm going to do is just snap them to the back leg here. And then I'm going to go into the side view. I'm going to move them down. So now that I'm in the side view, I'm just going to hold down V, but I'm only going to move in axis, so I'm sure I'm not going to snap over to the other side. And I'm going to put that right underneath his foot here, just somewhere here. I mean, we can change that later, but for now this is fine, like just pivoting around this place. So you can see like when I rotate this, the whole foot will come backwards like that. It's good for walk cycles and walks. Next thing for the hierarchy is I'm going to select the next object in the hierarchy. I'm going to just snap that to my joint here in the front. Just put that there. This is where my foot will pivot. So it's going to be rotating from here when my foot comes and rotates up all the way up here. And then the next thing, we're just going to place these two here in the ball. Before I do that, I'm just going to hold down V, so I'm sure that I'm staying in the axis. I could actually just go into my front view. Since I've snapped these ones to my joints, I'm just going to put that there. And now everything's great. I think these are a little, yeah, so now I have that pivot. I think these guys are a little bit too small. I don't want to change the actual scale, but what you can do on locator shapes is that you can change the actual shape size, so we just get something a little bit bigger here. And I want to go a little bit bigger because I want them to go through my foot so I can see them. There you go. So the two middle ones. I'm just going to take these two guys and pull them up here, like so. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to create a foot roll controller and a ball roll controller. So we can rotate from here and just rotate this top part of the leg, but make the foot stand still on the ground. So what I'm just going to do is duplicate my controller once more, and I'm going to delete all the stuff that's duplicated with it, so the IK handles that we currently have underneath. I'm going to take this one and call it leg hind, and I'm going to change that name to be called, instead of leg hind, I want to call it leg ball controller. So I'm going to delete the one here because it's no longer a name that's already existing, and now we have our three controllers. So this controller will actually be, let's change the shape of that a little bit so we can see what's going on, but this will be a controller that the animators will take and rotate just to rotate this top part. It'll also be the controller that will later on, when we add some advanced topics, will make automated roll. So let's try and select that just like this, and you'll see like that this foot will be following up here. So how are we going to do that? Well, it's quite simple really, because we just want to parent this IK handle that we have from here. So you can see the IK handle we had here, the foot or the leg hind. I'm just gonna parent that underneath my ball roll, and you'll see now. Oh, now I'm getting like this movement here, and that's exactly what we want. The foot is standing still, but we can actually move the top part of our leg, and that's really great. But the problem comes when we want to have the controllers following each other. So if I parent this one underneath here, you can see like how the foot is moving around. It looks great, everything's good. But as soon as I do this, my foot, I don't want my foot to go down and my foot to rotate forward. So we have to like make some compensation here. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is look into these locators, and we want to make them control our be controlled by our locators. And also we want to be able to have this controller be underneath our hierarchy, because as soon as we start rotating around this pivot and move this foot up, we want this controller to follow along so we can keep on tweaking our lower leg while we're still pivoting around the toe. So the first thing I'm going to do is just add, we're going to go into the controller here, my foot controller, leg controller. I'm going to add an attribute, and I'm going to call that attribute heel roll. I'm going to make it a float, and I'm not going to give it a limitation. I'm just going to keep it like this now. I'm going to go to, oh, I don't need to do that, so I'm just going to make a toe roll attribute, and I'm not going to give it a limitation. I'm going to make another one. It's going to be called tip roll. You can call it whatever you want. Like there's no rules, but if you want to keep it easy, then just follow along what I'm doing. So I'm going to close that down. So now I have these customized attributes for my leg. And the next thing I'm going to do is that, okay, I'm going to select the L hind leg, and I'm going to select my hind leg heel roll. Oh, sorry. And then I'm going to go to Window, I'm going to go to General, and I'm going to go to Connection Editor. In the Connection Editor, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say Show Non-Keyable, because I'm going to take that off. I don't want to see any of the non-keyable. I just want to see the keyables, and the keyables are the things that will be visual in my channel box. So I know that I just created these 3 attributes and they're keyable. So I'm going to select my hind leg control over here, and the pivot that I want to rotate on is the X. So you can see when I'm rotating this one, I'm actually rotating on X-axis. So I'm going to take my heel roll and put that into my rotate X. And then I'm going to select my foot hind leg, hind toe. I'm going to put that in here. I'm going to say toe roll, and I'm going to say activate that with X. So now when I'm selecting my controller and I'm running these, you'll see how the foot is actually rotating. And we want to add our IK handles underneath this hierarchy. So when I'm rotating my heel or my toe, you can see how that rotates the opposite way. I want to have my IK handles underneath this. So let's try and just start by parenting this stuff underneath. So let's get the toe pivot in here. I'm just going to parent that under my toe roll. So what happens now when I rotate my toe roll? Nothing. If I rotate my heel, sorry, I'm gonna have to pick my controller here. Heel roll. Okay, I'm gonna start moving something, but I don't really have everything, which is really annoying because I want to make sure that everything follows along the whole foot. So I'm gonna take this controller now. I'm gonna take the orient group of my controller. I'm gonna parent that into my hierarchy. I'm gonna put this underneath my ball roll, because once I have my ball roll rotating here, you'll see like how that foot will be rotating with it, and I can still go in and tweak my foot roll or my actual ball roll controller afterwards. Gives you a lot of freedom, gives you 2 controllers for your ball roll. So let's try and zero that out and take our ball roll here and zero that out as well. So now our controller is actually underneath this hierarchy. Some people will argue that we can make constraints to make the whole hierarchy, and yes, some people do that. It makes your rigs pretty slow. It's definitely possible to do it with only constraints. I've worked places where we've used constraints only. I've worked places where we didn't really bother. So, but in this case, we're just going to create a hierarchy because I don't want like some sort of constraint nightmare for people that are still like a little bit new. So we're going to parent into our hierarchies. Some people call it a little bit dirty way of rigging, but I think this is the best way to do it if you just want to learn the mechanics. So let's parent this whole hind leg hierarchy underneath our leg controller. And now when I move my leg controller around, you can see I have that whole foot moving, I can take my ball roll controller, rotate it. I can use my pivot point controllers to take my heel roll and my toe roll, which is great. So we still need to make our tip roll, and we do that by just selecting this this IK handle here, and we're just going to parent that under our tip roll. And now if I select my controller, take the tip roll, did I hook that up? Let's take the tip roll. So we haven't hooked that one up yet, so I'm just going to put that in here and say tip roll into my rotate X. And I'm going to select this controller now again, and I'm going to say tip roll, and you can see like how now I can move the tip alone, which means that I can make that really nice follow that overlapping that will happen when he would lift his leg. So now we basically have like a foot, but there's still one thing that's really annoying about this, and I'll show you what the issue is here. So if I close this one, let's just minimize this for now. The problem is now that everything actually seems to be working, and we can while we can definitely have a lot of movement here, and we can control our knee, we can control everything on the positions, everything here. It's all great, but the problem is though that we want our animators to be animating with a fair bit of speed, so they don't have to like go in and constantly tweak attributes. We also want to be able to do this, so they can rotate this toe or the toes without actually having to counter animate the toe pivot all the time. So the way we're going to do this is that we're actually going to hook the rotation of this hind leg controller up to the rotation of this controller. So whenever this controller is actually rotating, we are rotating this controller, we'll actually be counter rotating our ball roll controller. So we can control the rotation of the ball on our own and not let that be automated, because we would have to counter animate that all the time. So let's quickly just hook that up. So I'm just going to select my controller here. I'm going to minus all this, not minus, but reset all this stuff, and I think I put some rotation here. So now we're back to like standard, the basic. So what is it that I want to do? I know that I want to, when I rotate this forward, it gives me a positive value of 17, and what I want to do is get a negative value of 17. So I want to make an opposite and equal reaction to my rotation of my foot. So let's leave these things here. So the first thing I'm going to do is select my controller, my leg controller, and I'm going to go into node editor. And now we're going to create a node. So the first node I'm going to introduce you guys to is a multiply and divide node. So if I hit tab inside my node editor and write multiply, you can see like it's going to find that. I'm going to tap one down and I'm going to press enter. I'm going to get a multiply and divide node. I'm just going to name this so everything is neat and tidy. I'm going to call that L, and I'm going to say leg hind counter ball rod, and then mult, just to give it a prefix or suffix and an actual name that's descriptive of what we're doing. And I'm rotating around my x-axis, so I'm going to hold down right click, I'm going to click middle mouse click, and I'm going to drag and drop it onto. So you have to remember this can be a little bit tricky. So if you hold down control, middle mouse click, and hold it down on your leg hind controller, drag and drop it onto your multiply and divide node, you're going to get the connection editor. So I'm going to take the rotation of my x, and I'm going to put it into the input 1x. So you can see like now that's connected. And what is it I want to do? I want to get the opposite rotation. So I'm just going to take this one, and I'm going to take the value that comes into my, like the value that I get from my leg hind. I'm going to take that, I'm going to minus that with 1. So the way that the multiply and divide node works is that it looks at the x here, and it looks at the second x, and then it says like, okay, I'm going to multiply -1 with -17. If I had in the y-axis, if I put it into the y input, it would have multiplied it with 1, because the 1 would be like the second y would be multiplied with a 1y, and the set would be multiplied with the set, so x to x. So the output of this, if I now take my modify group here of my, this is the modify group of my ball, and I take this one and I add that, so you can see like add selected nodes to graph. So I get this node, comes in here, I'm going to drag it up here, and I'm going to hold down control, middle mouse, hold down, drag it over to my modify, and I'm gonna go here, and now now you want to see the outputs, and an output is a non-keyable attribute on it. So because you don't usually put something into an output, so it's a non-keyable. It just gives the result of whatever has been calculated inside the multiply and divide node. So I'm going to take the output of that result, output x. So I use the x channel,